Picture this. It's 1984. You're running the most profitable business on the planet. You move hundreds of millions of dollars every single month across 3 continents. You have thousands of employees in a dozen countries. You have warehouses, private planes, politicians, judges, and generals on your payroll. And you're doing all of this without the internet, without email, without encrypted messaging apps, without smartphones, without anything digital. Just human beings, telephone calls, and a system so airtight that the DEA didn't fully understand how it worked until years after they'd already arrested the people running it. This video is not about the guns, not the violence, not El Chapo's Netflix series. We're going deeper than that. We're talking about the logistics, the obsessively engineered machine underneath everything, the part nobody ever asks about. Because here's the question that nobody seems to ask. If you can't send an email, if there's no WhatsApp, if every phone call can be recorded by the government, how do you actually run a billion-dollar criminal empire? Most people assume cartels were just violent gangs who got lucky. But the real answer is something far stranger. These were some of the most sophisticated operational systems ever built by human beings. And they did it all with payphones, handshake agreements, and a level of human coordination that would make a Fortune 500 CEO nervous. By the end of this video, you're going to understand the air bridge, the surveillance reversal, and the money tricks so elegant that American businesses participated in it without committing a single crime. We're covering all of it. Let's go. Let's start with the actual problem because it's weirder than most people imagine. By the early 1980s, the Medellín cartel was generating an estimated $100 million per day in cocaine revenue. $100 million per day, and almost all of it was in cash, small bills, American dollars, sitting in the United States. This created a problem that sounds almost funny. They literally could not spend it fast enough. Pablo Escobar reportedly buried so much cash that he lost track of roughly $2.1 billion, just written off as eaten by rats or lost to moisture. That is not a metaphor. Rats physically ate millions of dollars stored in underground bunkers. But the real problem was moving the money. You cannot wire transfer $100 million to Colombia without the U.S. Treasury noticing. And you cannot fly it out because Customs searches for exactly that. The U.S. Bank Secrecy Act of 1970 required banks to report any cash transaction over $10,000. So the cartel faced 2 massive logistical puzzles at the same time. 1. How do you physically move cocaine from Colombia to millions of American buyers with no internet, no GPS, no digital coordination? 2. How do you then move hundreds of millions in cash back to Colombia with every bank in the country watching for exactly that? The solutions they invented were so clever that financial regulators still use them as case studies today. So let's start with the cocaine itself, because the logistics of moving it were genuinely revolutionary. In the early 1970s, cocaine was smuggled the cottage industry way. Individual mules swallowing balloons filled with cocaine paste and boarding commercial flights from Bogota to Miami. It worked, but it was slow, small, amateur. Then came Carlos Ledher, and everything changed. Ledher, who famously described himself as a disciple of both John Lennon and Adolf Hitler, genuinely one of the strangest human beings to ever exist, had a different idea. He'd been a car thief and small-time marijuana smuggler, but in prison in Connecticut, he met a marijuana pilot named George Young, the guy from the movie Blow, and the 2 of them had a conversation that would reshape the global drug trade forever. The insight was simple. Scale the aircraft, not the mules. Instead of 1 kilo per person per flight, fly entire planes of cocaine. You don't clear customs the same way. You land in places that aren't airports. You control your own infrastructure. In 1978, Ledher found his infrastructure. A small hook-shaped island in the Bahamas called Norman's Key, sitting 210 miles off the Florida coast. It had been a quiet resort for wealthy retirees, a marina, a clubhouse, 100 or so private homes, and, critically, it had an airstrip. Later bought the island using a shell company registered through a Nassau trust company. Then, methodically, he terrorized every single resident until they left. Armed men appeared at doors. A yacht was found drifting with its owner's corpse on board. People who refused to sell found that their decision had somehow been reversed. By 1980, the island was his. He extended the runway to 3,300 feet, long enough for fully loaded cargo aircraft. He installed radar systems to detect approaching law enforcement. He put Doberman attack dogs and armed guards on every beach. What he had built was essentially the FedEx hub model for cocaine. Colombian planes, loaded with hundreds of kilos, would fly north to Norman's Cay to refuel and offload. Smaller aircraft would then ferry loads into the Florida mainland, landing on rural roads, dry lake beds, private farm airstrips, anywhere that wasn't a real airport. At its peak, 300 kilograms of cocaine passed through Norman's Cay every single hour. Not per day, per hour. And here's the detail that most people miss entirely. This entire operation was coordinated by radio and in-person runners. No digital tracking, no GPS. Pilots flying into Norman's Cay were given oral briefings on schedules and codes. Landing coordinates were communicated by phone in coded phrases. Weather reports, references to fishing, completely mundane language that meant nothing to anyone listening. If a DEA plane appeared on the radar, the whole operation simply stopped. Planes diverted. The island went quiet. Then, when the coast was clear, it resumed. The DEA eventually became suspicious because Norman's Cay showed up on CIA surveillance imagery looking like O'Hare Airport. The then Vice President George H.W. Bush reportedly showed the Bahamian Prime Minister a printout of that imagery and said the island looked like O'Hare because of the constant takeoffs and landings. The Bahamian Prime Minister, who had reportedly been spending 8 times his reported salary, expressed appropriate concern. But here's what makes the Norman's Cay story even more significant than the crime itself. Ledher didn't just move drugs. He proved that you could build a private logistics network with its own infrastructure, its own communication codes, its own security apparatus, entirely outside the reach of the state. That model didn't die when Norman's Cay was eventually shut down. It got copied, refined, expanded. That's important. But the Medellín cartel was only half the story. Because while everyone was watching Pablo Escobar, the bombings, the assassinations, the war with the Colombian government, the other cartel was quietly building something far more dangerous. Here's something that almost never gets enough attention. DEA analysts called the Medellín cartel the Henry Ford of cocaine. They industrialized the routes, but they called the Cali cartel something different. They called them the McDonald's of cocaine. Because the Cali bosses didn't just move drugs, they turned drug trafficking into a corporate management system. Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela, former bank robbers, brought a fundamentally different philosophy to the business. Stay invisible, bribe everybody, never use violence if you can use money instead. Their communication system was extraordinary for the pre-internet era. They organized everything into independent cells, each managing a specific city or region in the United States. The cell leader in New York didn't know the cell leader in Los Angeles. If one was arrested and talked, they could only expose their cell. The rest continued operating without interruption. Each cell reported to a manager called a Celino. The Celino knew exactly one level up and one level down. The information flow was deliberately one-way and compartmentalized. It was, essentially, a pre-digital version of end-to-end encryption. The information was broken into segments that were useless without the entire chain. Calls were made from public payphones, rotated constantly. Conversations used everyday language. Shipments were merchandise. Buyers were clients. Cocaine was referred to by product names, often brand names of legitimate goods. Meetings were scheduled by references to soccer scores or weather conditions. To anyone listening, it sounded like a boring business call because it was designed to. But here's where it gets truly remarkable. And this is the part that almost no one talks about. In 1994, a counter-narcotics task force raided an upscale Cali condominium owned by a cartel associate. They expected drugs, maybe weapons. Instead, they found an IBM AS400 mainframe computer, a $1.5 million business machine typically used by mid-sized corporations. It was running around the clock, staffed by 4 to 6 full-time computer analysts. It took the DEA's best computer experts a full month to crack the encryption. What was on it was staggering. Not just financial records. The computer contained phone records for the entire cities of Bogota and Cali, purchased illegally through a cartel mole inside the phone company. It contained Colombia's complete motor vehicle registry, and it contained a surveillance database of every person the cartel considered a potential threat, including the home phone numbers of DEA agents, the call patterns of U.S. Embassy staff, and an active list of informants being tracked in real time. The cartel was doing what the NSA does now: metadata analysis on phone calls. If a Colombian citizen called the U.S. Embassy once, fine, but if they called twice a month, the computer flagged them as a potential informant. The cartel would then begin wiretapping that person's calls. The head of the local telephone company was eventually arrested for giving the cartel access to the entire city's phone infrastructure. Let that sink in for a second. The Cali cartel didn't just avoid surveillance. They reversed it. They were running counterintelligence operations against the DEA before the DEA even knew they were a target. That is not a drug gang. That is a shadow intelligence agency. And if you're finding this as fascinating as I am, drop a comment below with the word cartel. I'm genuinely curious how many people had no idea this level of infrastructure existed. It also helps the algorithm know this video is worth pushing to more people, so it helps both of us. Now we get to the part that financial investigators describe as genuinely brilliant: the money trick. And it's fascinating because it's almost legally invisible. By the late 1980s, the cartels had a problem that sounds absurd. They had too much money. Hundreds of millions in American cash sitting in safe houses across Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. And they needed it in Colombia as pesos. You can't wire transfer it. Banks ask questions. You can't fly it out. Customs searches for it. And the Bank Secrecy Act is watching every transaction over $10,000. So they invented something that financial regulators now call the black market peso exchange. And it is one of the most elegant financial schemes ever constructed. Here's how it worked. The cartel has, say, $10 million in drug cash sitting in a Miami safe house. They need it in Colombia, so they contact a peso broker, a money trader operating in Bogota. The broker finds legitimate Colombian businessmen who need US dollars to buy American products, a clothing importer, an electronics dealer, a shoe company that wants to buy goods directly from American suppliers. The cartel sells their US drug dollars to these brokers at a discount, maybe 30 to 40 cents on the dollar. The broker then pays American businesses in cash on behalf of the Colombian importer. The American business, completely unaware of the source, ships goods to Colombia. The Colombian importer sells those goods for pesos. The pesos go to the cartel. The drug money never crossed a border. It was converted into trade goods instead. The value transferred. The cash stayed put. And here's the part that made law enforcement want to pull their hair out. The American businesses being used as intermediaries were entirely clean. They were just selling shoes or appliances. They had no idea. Which meant that even when investigators found the network, they couldn't charge the visible end of it with anything. By 1990, this system, operating entirely through phone calls, couriers, and handshake agreements with no internet, no digital ledger, no blockchain, had become a $5 billion annual market. Scholars estimate that 45% of Colombia's entire imported consumer goods were paid through this mechanism at its peak. 45%. The entire thing ran on trust and violence. You kept your word because the alternative was being shot. Brokers maintained handwritten ledgers. Agreements were made in person or over coded calls. There was no paper trail that connected the cash to the cocaine to the shoes sitting in a Bogota storefront. It was invisible by design. And it worked for years before investigators even had a name for it. But none of this, not the air bridge, not the cell structure, not the peso exchange, would have been possible without the foundational technology that nobody ever talks about. The most important technology the cartels had was people. Everything we've covered required one thing underneath it: a massive network of ordinary human beings doing ordinary-looking jobs. Every piece of information had to be physically carried by a person. Every agreement had to be witnessed by a person. Every shipment had to be guided by a person. This created roles that are almost invisible in the historical record. Along major drug corridors, cartels maintained permanent networks of paid lookouts. Gas station attendants, restaurant workers, taxi drivers, shopkeepers. Their job was simply to radio in the appearance of law enforcement. Some were paid a small monthly retainer, others were simply threatened. The information traveled up a chain before it ever reached the smuggling team. By the time a DEA convoy reached a checkpoint, the news was already an hour ahead of them. Then there were the Smurfs. To get around the $10,000 bank reporting requirement, cartels employed networks of individuals who deposited just under $10,000 each across dozens of banks on the same day. A single drug shipment worth $500,000 might require 60 different people walking into 60 different bank branches and depositing $9,900 each, all on the same day, all with no visible connection to each other. Coordinating 60 people, 60 banks, one day, no group chat, no digital tool. That is pure human logistics. And then there were the accountants nobody knew about. The cartels employed armies of lawyers and financial specialists. Not to hide the money, that was the easy part, but to explain it. A Cali cartel operative who wanted to seem wealthy needed legitimate cover. Real estate, legal businesses, documented income. The cartel maintained entire legal offices, staffed by real lawyers, building paper trails for people who had never earned an honest peso. But perhaps the most chilling piece of human infrastructure was the corruption system itself. Plata o Plomo, silver or lead, is the phrase everyone knows. Take the bribe or take the bullet. But the actual system behind it was almost bureaucratic in its organization. The Medellín cartel didn't randomly bribe people. They categorized officials by role. They mapped every level of the judicial and law enforcement systems. And they ran what was effectively a standing offer program. Here is what we pay a traffic cop. Here is what we pay a judge. Here is what we pay a general. A bribery price list, maintained by human memory and personal relationships. Over 500 police officers, 200 judges, and countless politicians operated under it. Not out of ideology, not out of loyalty, out of a structured, predictable financial arrangement that the cartel managed like a payroll. When you understand that, you understand why the cartels were so hard to prosecute. It wasn't just that they had guns. It was that they had systematically purchased the institutions that were supposed to stop them. And they did it with the same methodical logic they applied to everything else. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. Before we get to the collapse, which has an irony at its center that I genuinely did not see coming when I first researched this, hit subscribe if you haven't already. I make videos exactly like this one. Deep dives into how complex systems actually worked, stripped of the Hollywood version. The next one is already in production, and it goes somewhere you won't expect. Okay, the collapse. Here's the irony at the heart of this entire story. The cartel's greatest strength, their reliance on human networks, personal trust, compartmentalized cells, face-to-face relationships, was also their fatal flaw. Because you can't arrest a cell structure, but you can flip one person inside it. When the DEA cracked the Cali cartel's IBM supercomputer in 1994, what they found wasn't just financial records. It was essentially a complete map of the cartel's human network. Thousands of names, phone numbers, bribe payments, informant surveillance logs, all meticulously recorded on a machine they thought was secure. The cartel's insistence on recording everything, because that's how you run a multinational business without email, became the evidence that destroyed it. Jorge Salcedo, the military officer who built the Cali cartel's entire hidden radio network and intelligence operation, eventually became an informant. Not because the DEA broke his encryption, not because they outmaneuvered his counterintelligence system, but because a single human relationship turned sour. One person, one conversation, one decision. Within 18 months of the supercomputer seizure, every major Cali boss was in prison. And within a decade, the entire ecosystem had migrated to Mexico. A new generation of cartels had watched the Colombians fall. They had studied every mistake, and they were already building something more decentralized, more violent, and much harder to map. The infrastructure moved. The logic stayed exactly the same. What's remarkable about all of this isn't the crime, it's the engineering. In an era with no internet, no GPS, no digital communication, a group of people with no formal business training built one of the most complex logistics networks in human history. They invented compartmentalization, metadata analysis, trade-based money laundering, hub-and-spoke distribution, decades before Silicon Valley made those phrases fashionable. They didn't have technology, so they built systems out of people instead. The air bridge turned a private island into the FedEx hub of cocaine. The cell structure created a pre-digital version of end-to-end encryption that kept entire continents of operations running, even when individual parts were arrested. The black market Peso exchange moved billions across borders without a single dollar ever crossing one. And the IBM supercomputer ran counterintelligence operations against the agency that was supposed to be hunting them. And the most unsettling part? A lot of what they invented is still in use today, just updated with the tools the internet eventually provided. The infrastructure changed. The logic never did. If this video made you think differently about how these systems actually worked, not the violence, not the mythology, but the actual mechanics, share it with someone who'd appreciate the engineering side of this story. That's the part that never gets covered, and it's the part that matters most if you want to understand why these networks are so hard to dismantle, even now. The next video goes somewhere connected to this. You'll want to be there for it.